We're here today to speak with one of the contributors to our new book, How to Heal Our Divides. Molly LaCroix is a licensed marriage and family therapist in private practice who received her master's degree in marriage and family therapy from Bethel Seminary, San Diego, and returned to Bethel as an adjunct professor in the MFT program. Molly has the highest possible level of training in the internal family systems model. Molly and her husband live in Central Oregon, visiting their children and grandchildren in Southern California as often as they possibly can. Her book, Restoring Relationship, Transforming Fear into Love Through Connection, integrates the internal family systems model and Christianity. So Molly, it's really wonderful to have you involved in our Healing Divides book.
Oh, thank you for offering for me to be included. It's wonderful.
Well, I think you're a perfect fit. You and this topic are exactly the type of thing that should be included in such a book. But I just gave a really brief overview of your background. Could you please tell us more about that and your practice?
Yeah, well, in my practice, I've long been interested in healing. And some models of psychotherapy are more about temporary symptom relief, which has its place. But I've always been drawn to approaches that really help us heal those deep wounds that are the source of a lot of the symptoms that we struggle with, whether that's symptoms in ourselves or things that provoke distress in relationships. And so I studied a number of different models and have found the internal family systems model to not only be a comprehensive approach to healing, but one that is highly congruent with Christian spirituality. And so when I came back around to it, I was exposed to it in grad school, but when I came back around to it, I dove all in. So I've done a lot of the training.
Good. Well, it sounds like it. I mean, and not only the training, but put it into practice, with lots of clients.
That's right. And that's, as they say, that's where the rubber meets the road. And when you see the impact with clients, some of whom I had worked with using other modalities and then shifted to this approach and really saw progress that I hadn't seen before.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
That's great to know.
Yeah.
So most of us are not familiar with psychotherapy at all, much less the internal family systems model. So could you explain it to us?
Yes. Briefly, as the name implies, the perspective of this model is that we are multiple, that multiplicity is actually a normal reflection of our humanity, not a sign of pathology, as is some people fear when they hear the term multiplicity. That when we begin to notice what's going on inside ourselves, that things that we thought were just random thoughts or emotions or sensations or images turn out to be the activity of parts of ourselves or subpersonalities. And what I found is when people are new to this concept of multiplicity, one of the things that makes sense to them is that most of us have done some kind of personality assessment. And so we recognize, well, I have these different traits, these personality traits. And this is really like taking that one step further and seeing those traits as the activity of different parts of ourselves. And so in developing this model, Dr. Richard Schwartz, who founded this model just through being radically curious and being willing to go wherever his clients took him, developed this model about 35 years ago. And it is what we call evidence-based, meaning there have been controlled, rigorous scientific studies done on this model to demonstrate the efficacy. And one of the things, not only did he start to see the activity of different parts in his clients, he also found that no matter what they had experienced in life, no matter how extreme the trauma or the adversity, they always had what he came to recognize as the leader of the family. And that the leader possessed these qualities that were not obliterated by what they'd experienced. They had just been blocked by the ways that we adapt to the suffering that's inevitable in this life. You know, we all experience some kind of adversity and we adapt to it. And so that's a distinctive feature of this model. And one of the things that I see is very congruent with Christian spirituality, you know, because the premise is that, you know, we were created in God's image, and the image of God cannot be obliterated by anything. It can be blocked, but it's there.
Interesting. So there's also an organization called the Internal Family Systems Institute that I believe Dr. Schwartz founded. Is that correct?
He's founded, still very involved with. Yeah.
No, just tell us more about that.
Yeah. The IFS Institute exists to support, you know, the promulgation of this model in not only in psychotherapy, but beyond. You know, it's being used in education, in corporate settings, in a variety of settings. So the training in this model is available not only to therapists, but to anyone who's interested and in learning this. And so the IFS Institute, you know, coordinates all the training, and there are different types of training available, different, you know, some of it's online and kind of overviews. So people who are interested in the model can learn much more. There's an extensive library of all the published articles that around the model that have been over the years. And so a lot of resources on the website.
And how do you see your clients or other people that have used this, you know, kind of at the consumer end? Mm-hmm. How has it benefited them? What are the kind of outcomes that you see?
Yeah, well, gosh, there are a number of ways to answer that question. And I think stepping back to how we use the model might help with the answer to the outcome.
Okay.
You know, so I've said we have these different parts of ourselves, and, you know, we call them family members and in this inner family, and we have a leader of the family. So what? But, and so what we do is develop relationships with those parts of ourselves. And I know that sounds very maybe abstract. Dr. Schwartz liked to call it family therapy in the dark. So just as we would turn our attention to a room full of people and speak to one at a time and get to know them, we have the same practice with whatever we notice going on inside ourselves. And to put it as simply as possible, the first thing we typically notice are what we call protective parts of us who are trying to manage people's perceptions, or trying to distract us from pain or numb out pain, just all these different strategies that we undertake to protect us from being overwhelmed by the pain that we carry from the wounds that we inevitably experience in life. And so it's a process of connecting with between this leader of the family and these different parts of the family, making these connections, establishing relationships. And there's a whole process involved in actually healing the wounds. But in the course of that, what happens is that one of the things people experience is the resolution of symptoms. So someone who experiences a great deal of anxiety, for instance, you know, we would, just see that anxiety as something carried by a member of their inner family. So we get to know them and help them with that. And so that they can, and that through that process, they can release that anxiety. And, you know, there are a variety of things that people experience that, and a process by which they can release the things that are burdensome and the ultimately, instead of a lot of protective strategies and activity to protect from pain, what happens is the system is transformed so that these parts of us can just do what they were always meant to do and bring, wonderful qualities that make us who we are.
Interesting. Yeah. So like you said earlier, you don't have the blockage anymore. You don't have things
That's right.
preventing you from being your best.
That's right. And again, in from the perspective of the integration of Christian spirituality, I think of it as releasing the constraints to the thing that is at the essence of our nature, which is being loving, So if that vision is the great commandment to love God, one another, and ourselves, this model really helps with the loving ourselves piece of it.
Mm-hmm.
And the more we can do that, the more we can do that with each other and with God.
Interesting. So let me play back to you my own internal families, I guess. So several times, I've come up against an issue and I've said, my head is telling me this and my heart is telling me that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So is those examples of two conflicting family members?
Exactly. Yeah. I often, when I'm describing this, because it's a new way of understanding ourselves. So I realize that sometimes it feels a little vague or abstract and, but all of us feel those dilemmas around a decision, right? Whatever that decision is, it can be something as simple as what am I going to have for lunch today? And something as profound as, am I staying in this relationship or not? Or am I going to switch jobs? And you always will notice some kind of tug of war, some polarity. And yes, when we understand that as the activity of different parts of ourselves, and we can bring the leader of the system, it's like having a team meeting. And yeah, you listen to, well, what do you have to say? And respect it. Even if, like, a lot of people will identify with the term inner critic. There's a lot out there about that. And so a lot of us will notice, having a part of ourselves that's pretty harsh, whether that's about our appearance or you name it. Our inner critics will find something to be upset with us for. And one of the popular approaches is to, try to ignore that or somehow banish it. But this model says, no, turn toward it. Why is it doing that? Can we bring some curiosity? Can we say, well, so like, let's say your head is, in this particular example, more of the critical stuff. And well, tell me more. And what do you hope to achieve by criticizing me? And it's fascinating, Brian, because one of the things I notice almost 100% of the time is as soon as we turn toward a part of us, it starts to calm down. It's very paradoxical, but because there's a lot out there that says, stuff it, move away from it. And we're saying, no, turn toward it, get curious. And the curiosity is one of those qualities the leader of the system possesses. And so when we can notice we're curious, we notice, okay, the leader's present. And we just kind of chat with these different parts of ourselves.
Wow.
And
so at the end of the day, how much of these blockages are driven by fear?
Well, the protective parts of our system are driven by fear. Yeah, and what they fear is our vulnerability. Mm-hmm. The adversity we experience in life leaves wounds, and things like, those worst things we believe about ourselves, like people are going to find out, I'm really not lovable.
The imposter syndrome.
Or I'm a fraud. That's a popular one, so these beliefs that we hold, there are painful emotions. Sometimes there are scenes that we can recall of times when this adversity occurred. Now, all of that material that's in there kind of is a threat to the functioning of the family, if you will. Mm-hmm, and so these other parts, their job is to keep all that stuff buried. And we call the parts of the system that hold that stuff exiles, Because the protectors say, like, if we can keep them in the basement of the family house, then it's not a threat. And so there's a lot of the activity of these different strategies that we undertake. We do the best we can do. We just try to adapt to survive. But the strategies, often there's a point in life where maybe something we had to do to survive as a kid, they're not working so well for us anymore, And what we do is we connect with those hardworking protective parts and say, if we could heal this stuff, you wouldn't have to keep doing this job. And a lot of times they're, with trust, they're on board and they allow for that.
Wow. So I mentioned the book that you had written, Restoring Relationships. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, the impetus for my book was actually seeing that although, most people in the church at large, in the Christian community, are well-intentioned, often people who are struggling will turn to their church community, their spiritual community for support. And unfortunately, though, in spite of being well-intentioned, there are a lot of practices, there are a lot of responses that aren't so helpful and in fact can be harmful. And so that, as I was seeing that was just sort of the beginnings of the inspiration for the book, because I knew, that I believe, this model teaches us a better way. And so in my book, I take a look at those problematic approaches. And in the worst case, things like judgment and legalism, but even things like advice giving and sort of what often happens is an overemphasis on, just believe the right thing and everything's going to be okay. Then I look at those kind of through the lens of this model so people can really begin to see, well, that's our fearful parts. We do these things because we're afraid of vulnerability. If I'm walking with somebody else whose vulnerability starts tapping into mine, that's scary territory, and so beginning to understand that. And in the book, I also just provide a brief overview of some of, how we're formed, our development as humans, and how vulnerable we are, and what happens in the course of life's experiences that again, these experiences we have stay in our system. And, of course, I provide an overview of this model and the integration with Christian spirituality, and then I apply it to common causes of distress, which include loss, betrayal, and under the umbrella of betrayal is adultery, abuse, racism. There are a lot of different forms of betrayal. I apply it to addiction and also to the emotional response to physical and mental illness. So, these common causes of distress are what provoke us to seek help. And first, if we want to come alongside somebody who's struggling with one of those things, we first need to know what happens in me when I'm confronted with these things, and so that's a piece of what the book walks people through. And then ultimately, I offer what I call a new spiritual practice. So if people resonate with this way of understanding themselves, there is a spiritual practice that we can do to connect with our own inner family members.
Well, it's really quite fascinating. It seems like it's been very helpful for many people, which is a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
So beyond reading, your book, which I think is a great thing I would recommend to a lot of folks, what other ways can people get involved in utilizing IFS?
Yeah, well, the first step is really, I think for therapists, it's really learning the model, beginning to apply it to ourselves. And so whether that's learning through a resource like my book, there are a couple of other books in this vein, if you will, that bring this model to the Christian community. A colleague of mine, Mary Steege, wrote a book titled The Spirit-Led Life. So there are some other resources out there. Most of these books are available through the bookstore that's on the IFS Institute website. And then if somebody's really interested, there are some different steps of training. So there are ways to do, whether it's a one-off workshop, sort of an introductory workshop, whether it's the kind of the next step is there's a 6-month online course that kind of walks people through this. And then for people who really want to use it in the course of their work, whether they're coaches or therapists or some kind of practitioner, then there's a whole program of training. So there are different degrees of, for different levels of interest.
And those are all by the IFS Institute or more?
Yes. Yes, all of those. Yes. Now, and then there are trainers within the IFS Institute who do standalone trainings outside of the umbrella of the IFS Institute as well. And so, for instance, you can look at YouTube and you will find different things that people have posted about this model.
So Molly, can you give us an example of how to apply this to heal, some specific type of divide?
Yeah, yes. Well, I think the best approach is for each of us individually to think about an issue that we maybe feel strongly about. And we know there are people that feel very differently, whether that's politics, racial issues, whatever it might be, all the different topics that are being covered in this book. And to notice what is going on in me as I consider engaging with someone who's on the other side of this divide. That the premise of my chapter is that in order to engage in, with openness and curiosity and a true desire for connection, which in my opinion is the only way we heal divides, we have to start with what is blocking my natural. See, I see connection and curiosity as innate desires of our heart as people who are made in God's image. And if I am not feeling those things, something's blocking it. And so my work is to do what we call in the IFS community a YOU turn, a U-turn, because the tendency in these areas of divide is to focus on the other person and why they should change, or to be ready with our argument of why we're right. And so our work is to turn inside and say, what's going on in me? So as a white person, what goes on inside me when I hear a person of color speak about their experience in this world? Is there anything blocking my openness, my curiosity, my compassion? Well, probably. If we're honest with ourselves, probably there's something there. Maybe there's defensiveness. Maybe there's a desire to protest. I'm not like those other people. Any of those things reflect the work of protective parts of us. And so if I can befriend parts of me that want to jump in with, say, defensiveness, then I can find out, well, where'd that come from? and do my work of healing anything in me that provokes this kind of protective response so that I can show up with a truly, authentically open heart and curiosity.
Wow. That I can see that would be powerful if you can master it, if a person can master it. But
yeah. And I do.
There's always going to be this tendency, right, to do the blocking.
That's right. And it does take, in the early going, when we're learning that's new, right? Whether it's the piano or a new way of understanding ourselves, we probably need some kind of guide, and so that's where, reading the books, there are a ton of books in the IFS Institute bookstore, so some very introductory, Richard Schwartz wrote one that's just called The Introduction to the Internal Family Systems Model. That's very brief, very clear. So just beginning to think about oneself this way, and, as a first step. And then if the intention is really to do more work and develop a relationship with the parts of us, maybe there will be a need for a guide to help in that process.
Interesting. Well, very cool. Well, Molly, I really appreciate you contributing this learning and expertise to this project. Many of the other chapters in the book are about organizations that do specific types of divide healing, racial reconciliation, or political divides, or religious divides, or what have you. But what you're talking about here, and what you bring to this book is unique in that it's a medically, scientifically based psychotherapy approach to how we can all live better lives and interact better. So that's really an important thing.
Yeah. Well, I hope it sparks curiosity, and certainly welcome people to connect with me through my website, which is just mollylacroix.com, and welcome comments and questions and interest.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again, Molly. Appreciate you being part of this program.
My pleasure.